There's a quiet kind of person who moves through the world with soft steps, someone who listens more than they speak, who absorbs more than they express. To others, they appear endlessly patient, endlessly compassionate, endlessly understanding, but beneath that gentleness lives a different story, one that rarely finds the courage to surface. Because being too understanding is not a gift without weight. It is a lifetime of putting aside one's own hurt to protect the feelings of others. And slowly, silently, the act of being easy to love becomes the reason they feel unseen. There's a moment in every overly understanding person's life when they realize something unsettling. They have spent years softening their tone, shrinking their needs, and rearranging their emotions so others can feel comfortable. But this pattern rarely begins in adulthood. It begins in the small, formative moments no one remembers clearly. Moments that whisper, not shout. Maybe it was the child who noticed the tension in the room before anyone spoke. Maybe it was the child who learned to read the changing weather in adults' faces. Maybe it was the child who discovered very early that staying calm meant staying safe. Some children grow up measuring love through intensity. Others grow up measuring love through stability. And then there are those who measure love through monitoring, watching, sensing, compensating, adapting. They learn to anticipate needs before needs were voiced. They learn to apologize even when nothing was their fault. They learn to swallow anger before it had time to become a full feeling. These patterns become automatic, almost instinctive. As adults, they look patient. They look emotionally mature. They look like they have endless room for other people's stories. But underneath that softness is a finely tuned emotional radar. A radar built from surviving environments where the slightest shift in tone meant everything. Psychologists call this hyper-empathy or high sensitivity to emotional cues. It is not weakness, it is not fragility, it is the residue of a nervous system trained to prioritize other people's comfort above its own. And so they become the person others rely on, the one who listens without judgment, the one who forgives before being asked, the one who says, "It's okay, don't worry," even when their heart tightens a little. The world sees them as peaceful, but peace is not always what they feel. Sometimes it is the quiet exhaustion of always holding space for everyone else. Sometimes it is the subtle ache of being praised for qualities that cost them more than anyone knows. The truth becomes clear. Being too understanding is not a coincidence. It is not a simple personality trait. It is the outcome of years spent learning that their emotions are secondary and their role is to absorb, soothe, and stabilize. And though this gentleness can be beautiful, it carries a weight they've been carrying for so long that it feels like part of who they are. There comes a point when understanding others stops being an act of empathy and becomes an act of disappearance. For the overly understanding person, this shift happens quietly, almost invisibly. They don't wake up one day and decide to sacrifice themselves. It unfolds slowly through a lifetime of being rewarded for their softness. Psychology calls it self-erasure, the quiet habit of prioritizing the emotional needs of others until your own identity becomes faint around the edges. People say they are mature. People say they are strong. People say they never cause problems. But these compliments rarely acknowledge the hidden cost. To be endlessly understanding, they must constantly silence the parts of themselves that feel too heavy, too inconvenient, too real. It begins with emotional minimization, the internal belief that their feelings are less important. They downplay hurt. They phrase needs as not a big deal. They convince themselves that speaking up will burden someone else. This internal logic forms a cycle. Feel the hurt, justify the hurt, suppress the hurt, over-understand the person who caused it. And with each repetition, their sense of self thins just a little more. There's also guilt, quiet, persistent guilt. Guilt for speaking too honestly. Guilt for asking for comfort. Guilt for being anything other than endlessly accommodating. To protect themselves from that guilt, they choose silence. Silence becomes easier than confrontation, easier than explaining, easier than risking that soft, familiar feeling of disappointing someone. Neurologically, the brain adapts to this pattern. Studies show that people who grow up in unpredictable or emotionally intense environments develop heightened conflict avoidance pathways. Their nervous system learns that disagreement equals danger, so they soothe others first, not out of generosity alone, but out of survival. This is the unseen psychology behind their compassion. Understanding others becomes a shield, a defense, a way of maintaining safety in relationships that feel fragile. But here lies the tragedy. The more they understand others, the less understood they feel. Because how can anyone meet needs that are never voiced? How can anyone see pain that is carefully covered with empathy? How can anyone know the truth of a person who constantly hides behind compassion? This is the quiet contradiction of being too understanding. They give others emotional space, while slowly losing their own. They become experts in comforting others, yet strangers to comforting themselves. And in this invisible erosion, one question begins to echo. If I'm always the one who understands, who will ever understand me? There's a moment, usually small, usually ordinary, when the overly understanding person begins to notice the quiet imbalance in their life. It might be during a conversation where they once again say, "It's fine," or in a moment of loneliness that feels heavier than usual, or in the sudden realization that they cannot remember the last time someone asked how they were really feeling. The turning point rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives gently, like a soft light entering a dim room. This is where self-awareness begins, in the subtle awareness that they have been absent from their own life. For years, their identity has been shaped around making others comfortable, around being the one who absorbs, who forgives, who steadies the emotional landscape for everyone else. But something in them slowly awakens. A curiosity, a longing, a quiet ache. Psychology calls this the reclamation stage, the moment when a person begins to recognize that they too are allowed to take up emotional space. It's not rebellion, it's not anger, it's simply the first breath after years of holding it. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable. They may feel guilty for needing rest, selfish for asking for clarity, unreasonable for setting even the smallest boundary. Their mind questions them. Is it wrong to say no? Will they be upset if I speak honestly? Do I deserve the same understanding I give? These questions reveal a truth they've avoided. For years they have given others what they never believed they could receive themselves. But slowly, gently, they begin to test it. They express a small need. They pause before offering automatic forgiveness. They wait a moment before reassuring someone. Those tiny pauses become acts of self-preservation. And with each quiet shift, something unexpected happens. The people who truly care begin to meet them. The people who only valued their softness begin to fall away. The world reorganizes itself around their emerging truth. This is not transformation in a dramatic sense. It is the slow return to self, the rediscovery of an inner voice that was quieted, not lost. And in this rediscovery, a deeper understanding forms, that being compassionate does not require self-erasure, that understanding others does not mean abandoning themselves, and that gentleness can coexist with boundaries without becoming any less genuine. In the final reflection, one truth becomes clear. The dark side of being too understanding is not the empathy itself, but the belief that empathy must come at the cost of one's own emotional reality. When they finally allow their needs to exist, softly, honestly, without apology, they do not become less understanding, they become whole.